Let me see if he shows up on the screen now.
Okay, can you hear me in the room? Everyone okay? And the mic is working?
We can
Okay.
hear you at home.
And hear me at home? Okay, wonderful. Well, it's great to be back. This is the third and final class session of this class on ecological virtue ethics. And you can see in the slide here that Earthkeeping and Character is the title of the course and the title of a new book that just came out last year that I authored. And let me just do a quick review. Okay. It was working earlier, but now I pressed it. But
His camera's not picking him up.
the up and the down.
Yeah.
Okay.
The camera's not picking him up either. It's not on screen.
Okay. Well, so if he stands at the podium, that's where we normally have.
Okay, but
So then you can point it at him.
yeah, but I know, but it's not showing up on the screen. It should do.
It'll show up at home though.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
We're seeing him at home.
Okay.
All right. Okay, well,
Thanks for patience with our technology here. Thank you. Just by way of review, the last couple classes, for those of you who participated and those who haven't, just a quick review. Main theories in ethics: conduct and character, duties and rights is one school of thought in ethics called deontology, the fancy name for that, and consequences, ethical approach that focuses on consequences is another main theory under the conduct side. That's called teleology. And what I'm doing here is talking about a third and different approach to ethics called etiology, the study of virtue, focuses on virtues and vices. Again, my friend Jamie Smith, I've mentioned this quote before in one of his recent books, arguing that what we do is driven by who we are, the kind of person we become. In my book, the opening chapter, I talk about what virtues are, and I'm not going to read this whole thing. We talked about it a couple classes ago, but that's a virtue is simply a praiseworthy character trait, habitual disposition to act in a certain praiseworthy way. The first set of virtues we talked about were wonder and humility. The settled disposition, I'm looking at number 3 here, to stand in rapt attention and enthralled amazement in the presence of awe-inspiring natural world. And that comes to mind, what comes to mind right now was last night's sunset. I don't know if you saw it. It was absolutely stunning. We had a couple of those in the last few days. Beautiful. If you have a view, I live on 12th Street, not far from here, and I can easily get down to Collin Park either by foot or by bike, with or without the dog, and it's just a beautiful view looking west, stunningly beautiful, and changing every minute or so with those, I guess they were altostratus clouds or cumulus clouds with the reflecting in the light. But that's an example of ecological wonder, rapt attention, enthralled amazement in the presence of something in the natural world. It may not be something like a sunset. It may be a trillium flower in May as it's just blossoming. Come on in. The capability of grateful amazement at the world of wonders God has made, sustains, and is redeeming, if you're a person who believes that God has made this and sustains the world in which we live. Ecological humility, I think, goes nicely with wonder. I often experience both of them at the same time as I describe some examples from the book. The settled disposition to act in such a way that we know our place and fit harmoniously into it, whether it's our local community, those of us here in Holland, our bioregion, that'd be the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes, or our home planet. The next set of virtues we looked at, self-control and wisdom. Again, I'm looking at number 3 here, ecological self-control, the habitual disposition, that's that common phrase, again, I'm using for virtually every virtue, to control our desires when it comes to caring for the natural world, based on a clear-eyed appraisal of what we have and truly need, an honest assessment of what others, human and non-human, need. We control our desires in order to foster the flourishing of others, and not just other people, but of ecosystems, our local habitats, etc. Wisdom, ecological wisdom, the disposition to make insightful and discerning judgments about our common home, the earth. We take seriously the cycles and scales of the natural world. We see everything connected to everything else. We adopt the canoeists' adage that you treat those downstream as you would have those upstream treat you. So again, taking classic virtues like self-control and wisdom, which are two of the four cardinal virtues for Plato and Aristotle in ancient Greco-Roman culture, and asking what would that look like if we expanded the range of those virtues to include the whole oikos. Last class, justice and love. I'm forgetting exactly how much of this we covered, but we talked about justice as fairness and equity, fueled by a respect for whatever it is involved, a human person typically. Virtue of justice, treat others fairly, fueled by an understanding of a proper regard for the integrity and well-being of the other. And there's only, I think, one vice, not two, that go with justice: injustice, treating people unfairly, inequitably. Ecological justice, settled disposition to act fairly when faced with the recognized rights or legitimate claims of creatures, both human and non-human. We not only respect the rights of all humans, which is justice as we normally think of it, but show respect for the value of domestic animals and wild plants, endangered species, and damaged ecosystems. What that looks like, we got to know our science in order to know what fairness and equity look like when it comes to things like that. Love, care, and compassion that promotes the good of another, not so you can look good in front of your friends or put that on your resume, but for the good of the other, good of the other for the sake of the other. Habitual disposition to care for the needs of others, promoting their goods and securing their rights as ends in themselves. I'm borrowing on a number of scholars here who want to push against the view that typically sets love and justice over against each other, and rather defines love in such a way that it includes concern for justice. You're not truly loving someone unless you are trying to secure their rights. The one vice here, again, I think there's only one vice, not two. As with justice, so with love. Carelessness, but I think there are two forms. Apathy, if love is care, not to care, to be indifferent or apathetic, seems to me that would be a vice. But so is malevolence, willing ill or evil, etymologically, of another. And so ecological love, as I'm trying to define it here, is the settled disposition to care about our house, our oikos, Greek word from which we get the prefix eco, and its inhabitants, and thus promote the flourishing of all creatures. You got a handout. Judy, if you pass those out, appreciate it. It's another green one. So we got justice and love. I've just talked about ecological justice and ecological love. Hold on to that handout, but I'd like for you to take a little time, you know what's coming, this is part of my teaching style, and talk about what is courage. We're going to focus on courage and hope, the last two virtues mentioned in the book. And you can cheat and look at the sheet if you want, or you can just talk about what is courage together. Just a few minutes in your group. And if you're online and you're with someone else, again, talk with that person about what is courage. And then if you're by yourself, just jot some things down on your computer or on a notepad. What is courage? And we'll come back and talk about that in just a few minutes. Just talking, yeah. Okay, let's continue the conversation. Someone start us off, share a bit about what you talked about together. Okay.
I want to have this lovely.
You need to get her close to the mic.
Oh, that's right.
I'm gonna start off by asking Kathy to stand up and to hold her sweatshirt and show everyone the sweatshirt, because this is courage.
Let's see, we have to get the camera. Turn, you come in front of the camera
Okay.
with your sweatshirt. Pardon?
All right.
Camera needs to see your sweatshirt.
Here's Kathy. Didn't
I'm not prepared for this.
Yeah, she didn't know her sweatshirt. There we go.
I truly did not do this in conjunction with courage, but
All right, say it for us. Bold and beloved.
this is Sharon's thing.
Okay.
But she needs the mic.
Okay.
Okay.
I can't read it. Okay.
Well, I'll read it then.
Okay.
Naomi, Orpah, Ruth, you, and me.
Bold and beloved.
Indeed. A little gem tucked away back in the Old Testament. What a story that is. Courage, all those women. If you're not sure what we're talking about, read the book of Ruth. It's probably read it in 20 minutes. It's a short little book, wonderful book in the Old Testament. Someone else here in the room, what'd you talk about with respect to courage? Judy.
We thought that a synonym for courage would be bravery, and we also said that it requires some strength to support it, some strength, some inner strength to build the courage from.
Okay. Thank you. Can't see the folks online this morning, or this afternoon rather, but anyone else here in the room? Thoughts on courage? All right, Sharon?
I think we also added that courage is it takes courage to step into a place that might be fearful or might be dangerous or requires risk. So I think there's that piece of the unknown at a minimum, and maybe even dangerous in in many different levels of what danger might look like, fearful.
So there's courage is a response to fear that we experience from uncertainty or danger. Okay. All right, back to your small groups. Some of you, I think, are already talking about hope, but let's focus on hope again. A couple minutes in your group. What in the heck is hope? What do we do when we hope? Likewise, online, if you're with someone, talk about what hope is and what do we do when we hope for something. And if you're by yourself, just jot down some reflections. Writing helps us think. Bless you.
Basically, now that we're doing it, we're going to neuroscience.
Okay, let's talk about hope. Again, share, if you would, please, something about hope that you discussed together with your partner.
We would like to ask if you know the story of naming Hope College. Do you know the story of naming
Hope
Hope College?
College. Well, I've heard through the proverbial grapevine that it was Albertus Van Raalti's, he picked Spera and Deo, hope in God, was a kind of pivotal Bible verse, and that the name arose from his allegiance to that. That, what better name than hope for a Christian liberal arts college?
So basically, he was responsible.
I think so, but I would want to talk, I have some books I could refer to, but talk to people like Elton Bruins and others, scholars who, know the history of hope much better than I do. But it is unusual, we don't have Faith College or Love College, but we have Hope College. You think of the 3 theological virtues. And I can think of lots of names of really stupid colleges and universities. Stupid names, the colleges aren't, but I won't mention any examples, but, to be labeled Hope College is not a stupid name. It's an aspirational name, certainly. Whether we live up to it is another question, but it's not a bad name to have if you're going to have a college. So, Judy.
I'm not sure if it was Van Raalte or Philip Phelps that said about the college that this is my anchor of hope for the future. And the anchor has been a symbol of Hope College for quite some time. And a college or university that I think has a less than wonderful name is Stetson University in DeLand, Florida, named after a hat.
You gave that example, I didn't. Yeah, Anchor of Hope, yep. I think it may have been Philip Phelps, actually, because a lot of people give Van Raalte credit when, in fact, the historians do the digging and find out that Philip Phelps had a much bigger role than most people realize. Anyone else on hope? Yeah, Don.
I think hope is rested in a dissatisfaction, right? You have to be longing for something other than what's here. I'm not sure whether it has to be irrational or not, but sometimes it seems like it does. No, seriously.
Yeah.
If it's something you could easily see your way from here to there in 6 steps, is that hope or is that a plan?
Yeah. And if you want some good future, but it's simply impossible, you still keep hoping for it, that sounds irrational too, in its own way. Yeah. That's a great point. Hope stems from some sense that things aren't the way they're supposed to be. Some desire for a better future of some sort or another. Yeah. Fueled by a kind of restlessness. That's a very good point. Okay, let me put this back on.
Maybe you need to change your slide.
Yep, I'm going to in just a minute, because the next slide is a summary of courage and hope. And you have a handout, those of you here in the room, but I'll get to that in a minute. I want to start a little further back. Some contemplations about courage. A knight in shining armor battling the bad guys. A group of soldiers planting a flag on foreign soil. A Jedi master vanquishing an evil marauder. Our popular idea of courage has long been connected with obvious displays of heroism. While these figures are in some sense heroic, does courage consist solely in daring acts of aggression? Naming characters from the popular Harry Potter series as exemplars of courage, Rebecca Conondike DeYoung, a friend of mine who teaches at Calvin University, cites Harry's thrilling triumphs against Voldemort and James Potter's dying defense of his family against the same villain as illustrations of this aggressive and daring courage. However, she also contends that this kind of bravery, while admirable, does not provide a complete understanding of courage. Luca van Wensveen, a scholar of virtue ethics theory, a friend of mine, seconds that assertion. Luca is a woman, a Dutch professor in the Netherlands. Quote, Rambo-like pictures of courage, she argues, are not only incomplete, but also dangerous. To think that courage necessarily implies violence, she argues, is simply false and easily perpetuates a never-ending cycle of violence. Courage comes in more kinds than the ones that traffic in violence. For example, she argues, what about the acts of courage shown by Martin Luther King Jr. and his followers in the civil rights movement, who responded to bombings, beatings, and police brutality with nonviolent resistance? What about the palpable courage shown by families and friends who face a diagnosis of cancer with fearlessness and endurance? So courage, she argues, I think rightly, is not necessarily yoked to violence. Furthermore, she and others point out, the view of courage as necessarily violent has a decidedly male legacy. It stereotypically defines courage as a virtue available only to men, since males, it is assumed, are by nature aggressive, and courage, it's assumed, has to do with aggression. Hence, women are incapable of being courageous, or if they are capable, the courage of women is inferior to that of men. For example, listen to these words from a widely quoted tutor in virtue ethics. I quote, clearly then, moral virtue belongs to all of them. Men, slaves, women, and children are the them referred to here. But the temperance of a man and of a woman, or the courage and justice of a man and of a woman, are not, as Socrates maintained, the same. The courage of a man is shown in commanding, of a woman in obeying. End quote. That's Plato's most famous student, Aristotle. In Aristotle's view, a woman can be courageous only insofar as her subservient nature allows her. Thomas Aquinas, let's move ahead and pick on a Christian here, very influential Christian from the Middle Ages, died in 1274. Thomas Aquinas too doubted a woman's ability to possess courage because he believed women to be less rational than men. In his opinion, women are ruled by emotion, rendering them more likely to succumb to fear and thus less likely to display courage. Needless to say, this sexist legacy regarding courage is highly problematic. Such interpretations of courage are necessarily masculine or strictly aggressive do not capture the clear examples of courage that span the range of humans, male and female. So going back to Rebecca, she gets to the heart of the matter in one of her books. She says, when she observes that the virtue of courage is most often defined by its regulation of fear. And a number of you, I noticed, were talking about this. As she succinctly puts it, courageous people need not be fearless, but they are not overcome by their fear. Rather, they have mastery over it. So courage names the habitual disposition, this is me now summarizing her, that allows us to take our fears seriously, but not be overwhelmed by them, to persevere when fearful in order to obtain some good. For example, J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, Peter Pettigrew, whose fear leads him to betray those he loves, stands in contrast to Harry Potter, who shows us how courage is the power to withstand fear for the sake of protecting what is good. Both of them experience fear. One is overcome by it, while the other exercises some control over it. Courage, in short, is a kind of strength in the face of fear. And let's be honest, fear is a natural, normal emotion that we experience from time to time. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with being fearful in circumstances that genuinely are dangerous or pose some threat. The moral question has to do with what we do when we feel that emotion. Do we cave into it? Do we ignore it? Or do we try to control it? So courage, in other words, as Rebecca DeYoung and many others would have us believe, is a kind of endurance that perseveres in the face of fear. And in the Middle Ages, in the Christian tradition, that virtue, Greco-Roman virtue of courage, morphs into fortitude. That becomes another name for a similar idea. Thomas Aquinas speaks about fortitude as the mean between faint-heartedness on the one hand and rashness or recklessness on the other. But fortitude requires other virtues, sister virtues like prudence, practical wisdom, and justice. We've talked about those in the last few weeks. And Aquinas reminds us fortitude is not real fortitude without caritas, the Latin word for love, Greek being agape. So now let's push that, wrong way. There we go. The handout that you all have in the class, or those of you online. Courage is resoluteness of spirit despite the fearful awareness of danger. And to pick up the bit about fortitude, tenacity in the face of adversity. The virtue of courage or fortitude, the habitual disposition to persevere in the face of opposition or adversity. And its vices are cowardice, if you don't have enough, rashness or recklessness, if you don't take your fear seriously enough. I earlier today was meeting with a former student who's now in graduate school at Colorado State University, and one of the things he's doing besides lots of chemical engineering research is rock climbing. And I made sure when he emailed me some time ago that he was doing, make sure you're with the right people. People who take seriously the fear, I'm an old rock climber, that comes with rock climbing. It's because that fear, as long as it doesn't overwhelm you, you take it seriously, act courageously, you just don't do rash or reckless things. You make sure all your knots are proper, that the gear is on right, that you're with people who know what they're doing. So nothing wrong with being fearful. If you're not fearful when you're climbing, something's wrong with you. You're not taking the risks seriously enough. You're in danger of being rash or reckless. So, ecological courage. Moral strength, a number of you again picked up on this, is a kind of strength, in this case a moral strength. When fearful about real or potential ecological losses, and again to pick up the fortitude side, steadfast endurance in the face of seemingly intractable ecological problems. And this gets at some of the issues you've already mentioned. Don mentioned some. When is it rational? When is it irrational? Fortitude with respect to caring for our home, our oikos, our home planet. Lots of writers, I mentioned some of them in the chapter in the book on this. I'm not going to go over those here, but almost everybody writing in this field chimes in on courage or something like ecological courage. This shows up in their lists of ecological virtues. The vice of deficiency here for ecological courage is what I call ecological cowardness or faint-heartedness. the inability or unwillingness to act with courage when some environmental good is at risk, the local watershed, the air we breathe, the park down the street, or some non-human creature is in peril. Think of all those creatures. There were, 50 or so, according to one statistic, that went extinct last year, never to be seen again on our planet. One of my earlier books is on the Endangered Species Act and why Christians ought to support it. That's 20 years ago now. But that's still a huge issue. It's the disposition, this vice, ecological faint-heartedness, to cave in when courage is needed to confront the perpetrators of the local water crisis. It's the habitual failure to stick with that letter-writing campaign to preserve the local park. I know a number of you well enough to know that you're involved in this. Don especially has been one of the leaders in our local area here in West Michigan, Southwest Michigan, in galvanizing support for policy changes and support for ecological health of our place. The vice of excess here I call ecological recklessness. When this habitual disposition becomes a character flaw, we charge ahead with our group's favorite, quote, environmental project without doing the necessary homework or listening to the needs and wants of all those affected. Luca van Vensveen, my friend Luca from the Netherlands, observes that courage can be warped into something sinister when pushed to excess. Extreme, she calls them Rambo-like, reference to an old film. Courage can glorify fearlessness and place pressure on individuals to repress instinctive emotions. Fear is interpreted as a sign of weakness in this case, and a culture of repression can flourish. So ecological courage. Yeah, species extinction is a real problem, but we need, and something causes fear and anxiety, but it's something we need to address. We need to have a kind of strength of character to work in such a way that our non-human neighbors don't lose their habitats. That's the single biggest cause of species extinction. It's not people going out and shooting animals or chopping down trees. An animal or a plant loses its home, goes homeless, and eventually will go extinct. Any questions on courage, the virtue of courage, or ecological courage? All right, let me give you an example. If you've read chapter 5 in Earthkeeping and Character, you know this. This is a friend of mine from my early days years ago in the Christian creation care movement. It's page 103 in the book. I'm just going to read a short little excerpt from a story told there about Susan Hart. Susan's dilemma. Susan Hart's home was nestled in the quietest corner of a hollow in Prestonville, Kentucky, a place her family had called home for 4 generations. Tiptoeing the upper boundaries of middle age, Susan lived alone. Her 2 children had long since moved out of the family home, from which she now operated daycare service for local families. Each morning she opened her doors to overwhelmed parents who trusted their children to her expert care. She spent each day playing with, cooking for, and cleaning up little boys and girls until mid-evening, when she opened her door with a knowing smile to the last tired and grateful parent returning from work. At last, Susan could have some calm. Sitting on the steps of her front porch, she took in the peace and stillness of the old hills at dusk. And she beheld acres of land that had been home to her family for nearly 100 years. Susan was filled with a great sense of belonging. Yet she found herself unable to empty her mind of worry. Left alone with her thoughts, her mind was consumed with the previous evening's telephone conversation. The night before, the phone rang just as she sat down on the porch steps. It gave her a start. She stood back up, opened the creaky screen door, and shuffled in her slippers over to where the telephone rested on its cradle, one of those old-fashioned black phones. The man on the phone was a legal representative of Omega Energy Incorporated, one of the nation's leading extractors of Appalachian coal. After politely introducing himself, the man wasted no time in informing Susan that Omega Energy was interested, indeed very interested, in acquiring her property, since the company was in the process of drawing up plans to strip mine the adjacent mountain. He was quite direct in his manner of speaking. Omega would pay her fairly for her acreage. He then named the company's price. Moments later, after the man left her with his phone number and a promise to be in touch soon, Susan slowly hung up the phone, silent and bewildered. Now, with time to think, Susan considered the proposal. Omega had offered a tempting sum of money, very large sum of money. With only the income from the daycare to support her, Susan, like so many of her neighbors, was forever financially insecure. With the money from the coal company, she could live comfortably in the present as she never had before, and her fears about the future would be assuaged as well. If she refused to sell, she would likely lose the revenue from her daycare center. What parent in their right mind would deposit their child so close to a mountaintop removal site, MTR for short, with its warlike explosions and its hulking coal trucks hustling down the narrow mountain roads? If Susan were to hold her ground, she might lose her business and her livelihood. Whatever her decision, the community was clearly divided by these recent developments. Of those approached by Omega, some residents said they were choosing to stay, while others had decided to take the money. The takers were doing so because of their poverty and perhaps out of fear. In the past, it was not uncommon for holdouts to be harassed. Susan thought of the array of bumper stickers plastered on her neighbors' trucks, sporting phrases such as, "I'm a friend of coal," quote unquote, or "Don't like coal? Sit in the dark!" exclamation point, quote unquote. I'm not making any of this up, by the way. This is from Susan's recitation to me of this event in her life. Many people in her community were unfalteringly loyal to the industry that had fed their families for generations. Truth in advertising here, both of my grandfathers were coal miners in southern Illinois. To stand her ground and refuse this offer might be taken as a statement of dissent, one that would, at the very least, cause a rift between Susan and the pro-coal members of the community. This was disconcerting to Susan, who was agreeable and generally apolitical by nature. Even the idea of discussing the predicament with her neighbors was unsettling to her. Despite the strong sense of community in the hollow, residents did not generally discuss decisions like this with one another. To bring this sort of thing up would be perceived as prying, and that just wasn't done. And yet this prospect of selling her land to the coal company didn't sit well with Susan. According to the Omega lawyer, the company wanted to acquire her property for purposes of strip mining. It would pay her fairly. This all seemed very cut and dried, the language of a business transaction. But to Susan, the phrasing was deceivingly abstract. After all, if Omega did, quote, acquire her property, the company would then own and control the hallowed place of nearly a century of her family's history. They would be acquiring the first tree she ever climbed, a dogwood her father helped her scramble up when she was just 5 years old. They would own the stream in which her own children had gleefully splashed only a few years ago. And surely the mining would permanently disfigure the mountain that had been the backdrop of her life in the hollow. Susan knew that the process the lawyer had referred to as strip mining was also commonly known as mountaintop removal. What could possibly be a fair price, quote unquote, for the utter destruction of the land? What could possibly be a just payment, quote unquote, for the loss of her home and the uprooting of her life? And Susan had heard rumors that MTR, mountaintop removal, causes water pollution, poses risks of cardiovascular disease and lung disease, and increases the risk of birth defects and cancer. She didn't want anything to do with those things. Her children argued that the coal industry's preeminence had prevented Appalachia from developing any semblance of a healthy economy. The promise of abundance brought by MTR mining, they contended, was especially unreasonable, given that the highly mechanized technique was devised in part as a way to keep costs low by employing fewer workers. But in a culture trapped in a relentless cycle of poverty, any perceived threat to income is taken seriously, especially when those most profiting from coal extraction actively fan the flames of job loss fear. The result is the vehemently pro-coal stance that grips much of Appalachia, evident in the ubiquitous bumper stickers that I've mentioned, and billboards that declare coal keeps the lights on, and more severely in the intimidation and harassment of anti-coal activists. Such behavior gives potential on-the-fence holdouts like Susan reason to fear. In Susan Hart's Hollow in Kentucky and throughout Appalachia, people are in search of courage. It was growing dark. Last part of the story here. Susan's long day and restless mind had exhausted her. She stood up to go inside, but before she made it through the door, Susan turned around to glance once more at the land in front of her home. A soft pink-yellow glow from the setting sun lingered just over the mountains. A northern cardinal, the state bird, gave its signature call. And with a sigh, Susan crossed her threshold and shut the door behind her. Though the hour was late, she dialed the phone number Omega's legal representative had given her. This time, she was the one to keep things direct. Any guesses on what she said? In a terse voicemail, Susan informed the lawyer that she would not be parting with her home anytime soon. One of the best examples of courage I can think of, coming from a poor woman in Appalachia who stands to lose a lot by making that decision. All right, let's turn to hope. Emily Dickinson, you may know this famous poem. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Plenty Coup, the last great chief of the Crow Nation, knew something about hope. Facing the destruction of his people and their way of life at the end of the 19th century, he had a dream, literally a dream. This was written about in a number of books. A vision of a radically new future. But this dream meant that he and his people would have to be willing to give up almost everything they understood about the good life. They would have to imagine and believe possible a radically different way of life. What author Jonathan Lear, who writes extensively about this part of American history, calls a radical hope. He defines, Lear does, radical hope this way: it anticipates a good for which those who have the hope as yet lack the appropriate concepts with which to even understand it, end quote. Hope, in short, requires using our imagination to envision some good future, even if this transcends our traditional ways of thinking. Radical hope, Lear notes, is different than optimism. Optimism rests on naive beliefs about some possible future, while hope is based on some warranted reason or evidence, even if it offers no proof or certainty. Hope is different from optimism because optimism is an inclination to put the most favorable face on actions or events without adequate warrant or reason, while hope rests in something more secure. David Orr, contemporary environmental studies guru, Oberlin College, now retired, says, yes, optimism and hope are not the same thing. And I am emphasizing this because often I think they're confused. People talk about hope and they're really talking about optimism or vice versa. Optimism is the recognition, says David Orr, that the odds are in your favor, while hope, I'm quoting, is faith that things will work out whatever the odds. Optimism, he continues, this is Orr again, quote, leans back, puts its feet up, and wears a confident look, knowing that the deck is stacked. While hopeful people, quoting David Orr again, are actively engaged in defying the odds or changing the odds. Orr proceeds to list the rising odds against a good life in a hotter world. Global climate change. More heat waves and droughts, more and larger storms, bigger hurricanes, rising ocean levels, more tropical diseases in formerly temperate places, more and nastier bugs. It's a long and sobering list. He concludes, we're playing a global version of Russian roulette. Optimism, he maintains, is like whistling as one walks past the graveyard at night. There's no good case to be made for it. Hope, however, says Orr, requires us to check our optimism at the door and enter the future without illusions. Requires a level of honesty, self-awareness, and sobriety that's difficult to sustain. And Orr also notes the connections between hope and courage, which is why I put the two together in this last substantive chapter of the book. I think he's spot on here. Authentic hope, Orr argues, is made of sterner stuff than optimism. Authentic hope must be rooted in the truth as best we can see it, knowing that our vision is always partial. I'm quoting Orr again. Hope requires the courage to reach farther, dig deeper, confront our limits and those of nature, work harder and dream dreams. In the face of climate change, Orr argues, it's the glaring absence of such courage that renders genuine hope so difficult. How can we imagine a good future if we're unwilling to face the present courageously and clear-sightedly? As long as we refuse to acknowledge that we're playing climate roulette, as he puts it, we will not make progress on addressing climate change. So, Orr says, I've got this up here somewhere, yeah. I love this line. First, we'll start here. When we hope, confident expectation of some good future. When we hope, we do these things. This is from Lou Smedes. I'm not going to read the whole part in the book, but simply summarize. We wish for some good future. We imagine what that good future looks like. We believe that good future is possible. And we act to bring that good future to fruition. That's the key part for Orr. This is the quote I was looking for. Orr says, hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. It's not just wishing for some good future, imagining what that looks like, and believing, of course, it's possible, but it's acting in such a way as to, so far as you can, make it real. I hoped to be a professional football player when I was growing up as a kid. But at 5'9", and 165 pounds, that was what I weighed when I played at Hope College for 4 years. That just wasn't going to happen. So not possible. I had to give up that hope when I realized actually in high school I wasn't going to get that big. And I was fast, the fastest kid on the Hope team, but that's Division III, that's not Division I, certainly not pro football. So an honest acknowledgement of one's own limits forced me to give up the hope of ever being a pro football player, which I happily did, actually, because I had a successful career in college, and that was good enough. But the hopes we have, finding someone to spend the rest of your life with, which is a hope of many of my students, or passing that class, or getting on the dean's list, or getting into fill-in-the-blank graduate school, med school, dent school, vet school, business school, getting that really good first job. We have all these visions of some good future. We wish for it. We imagine what it looks like. We believe that it's really, truly possible. And if it's really hope, we roll our sleeves up and we act in certain ways to make that future real. This is a quote from Orr. Hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. In contrast to optimism or despair, hope requires that one actually do something to improve the world. Authentic hope comes with an imperative to act. This is also from Orr. There's no such thing as passive hope. So hope is an imperative. So, the settled disposition, the virtue of hope, to act with confidence to bring about some imagined good future. The vices here are despair, desperare, etymologically, literally absence of hope. Spera, in Dale, right, hope. And what I call presumptuousness, which is a kind of optimism, I guess, right? You just think something good's going to happen and you presume you don't have to do anything about it. Ecological hope, the settled disposition to act so as to bring about the flourishing of all creation. Again, the oikos. We habitually act in such a way that God's good future of shalom, a just community, a beautiful neighborhood, a healthy watershed, a flourishing home planet, fill in the blank with whatever you would consider some good future to be, that becomes reality. An exemplar. Susan Hart, I mentioned for courage. Many people come to mind as exemplars of courage and hope. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a brilliant and caring German pastor who at the age of 39 was put to death by the Nazis in 1945 as a result of his involvement in a plot to kill Adolf Hitler. Bonhoeffer embodied both great courage and robust hope. Martin Luther King Jr. easily qualifies as a beacon of courage and hope for people still today. Or Mother Teresa of Calcutta, a shining embodiment of courage and hope. However, this is at the very end of this chapter, I focus on Jane Goodall, who I'm guessing everyone in this room knows, and the folks online. My college students often don't know who Jane Goodall is or was. I think she stands out as a sterling example of ecological courage and hope. Let me just briefly fill in a few of the details here. Most of you probably know this story well. Born in London in 1934, Goodall developed an interest in chimps when her father gave her a stuffed chimpanzee instead of a teddy bear when she was a child. I wonder if he ever thought what would happen after giving not a teddy bear but a chimpanzee. Oh, mercy. She moved to Kenya in 1957, found work as a secretary, and on the advice of a friend contacted Louis Leakey, the famous archaeologist and paleontologist. Leakey hired Goodall as a secretary, but sent her to the Olduvai Gorge to do research on chimps. After Goodall spent time in London studying primate behavior, Leakey then sent her to what is now the Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania. After 2 years of research, Goodall began a doctoral program at Cambridge University, including a PhD in ethology, animal behavior, in 1965 that focused on her research with chimpanzees. Goodall continued her pioneering work in Africa for the next 4 decades, during which time she became a tireless activist for the protection of animals and the preservation of their habitats. Talk about hope as a disposition to act, with your sleeves rolled up. In 1977, Goodall established the Jane Goodall Institute, an environmental conservation organization based in Virginia. In 1991, she founded Roots and Shoots. Google that if you're interested. Conservation awareness program for children. It's now active in 70 countries. That's when I wrote this, probably more now, probably closer to 90 or 100 now. A prolific author. Some of her most well-known books are In the Shadow of Man, Chimpanzees of Gombe, Reasons for Hope, subtitled A Spiritual Journey, and Hope for Animals and Their World, subtitled How Endangered Species Are Being Rescued from the Brink. No secret now why I chose her as an exemplar of hope when you write books with titles like that. She's also authored 11 children's books and received at last count, this is now 10 years ago or so, 20 awards, recipient of a dozen honorary doctoral degrees from universities all over the world. She's famous, Goodall is, for her groundbreaking research on the behavior of chimpanzees. She was one of the first scientists to observe and record emotion, intelligence, and family relations among chimps. And even more controversially, she documented chimps' use of tools. Some people call us humans Homo faber, not Homo sapiens. We are the technology-making human. And it was believed for a long time that only humans, that was a distinguishing trait or feature of what it meant to be human. And Goodall was one of the first to show that we are not the only organisms or creatures to make and use tools. Chimpanzees do. These claims ran counter to the science of the time, and as a result, her research was criticized. And it was not insignificant that she was a she. A woman back then, a scientist was, and she took all kinds of criticism unfairly, simply because she was a woman. Despite such criticism, much of it due to the regnant sexism of the time, she persevered in her research, and as the titles of 4 of her books explicitly indicate, came to eloquently express and embody hope for animals and those who care about them and for them. Goodall also contravened the scientific conventions of the day by naming the animals she studied, developing close relationships with them, the most famous perhaps being the male chimpanzee, whom she called David Graybeard. Goodall is well known as a resolute example of courage and an inspiring beacon of hope for all those who are striving to preserve and protect non-human creatures most endangered in the world in which they and we live. Questions or comments? Take a break there. I've been reading too much, but these stories are fascinating, and they give me a lot of inspiration, courage, and hope. Questions or comments on anything here on this slide, on courage or hope, or anything about the people I've read about, one of whom is famous, Jane Goodall, one of whom I've probably never heard of before, Susan Hart.
The back of the room? Steve?
Yeah, Don.
You want to take the
Oh, yep, take the mic.
Yeah, Steve, I was really inspired by what you wrote in these chapters and what you're saying today. But I think, it's possible to interpret courage and hope as a good business plan, right?
Yeah.
You can see the future, you know what it takes, you want it, you execute. But the most moving examples that you mentioned and others that come to my mind, courage and hope that can only be rewarded in the end by an act of God, not a good business plan. Now that's a Christian perspective or a theological perspective, but there's a huge difference. Say, I'm doing the best I can, I got the best plan and the best resources, and it still doesn't look like anything's going to come of this, but I'm going to keep going because I'm going to rely on an act of God.
That's a great point. Excellent point. Which those of us who are Christians reminds us that, ultimately our lives and what we do with them, we try to live as well as we can, but we're in the hands of God's grace. So too with work in ecological issues and topics like this. Some Christians, unfortunately, use that as an example or a means, a reason for doing nothing, and saying it's in God's hands, so what can I do? On the other hand, other secular folks I know, folks who don't believe in God, they run up hard against despair when their actions don't produce the results that they hope they would. So, so we Christians are called to live a life of discipleship, trying to follow the path of Jesus as best we can, and leave the results to God. But we do so with the spirit of hope, knowing that God's good future is in God's good hands. But that doesn't get us off the hook. It's a non sequitur than to argue, well, we just can sit on our hands and do nothing. So that's the caveat I would want to always say to those who say, it's in God's hands. Yeah, and that God wants you to get off your butt and do something. That God will bless our work. Yeah. Other thoughts or reflections? Yeah. Oh, okay. Judy's closer. Okay.
I was thinking of the significance of Omega Coal Company. Omega means the end of something. and you know, it's the end of a good life for the person who has to sell out and have the mountaintop removed. And you know, it ruins the landscape. And frankly, it's a better thing for people in those areas if they can find sustainable new work. And it takes a national effort, I think, to focus on those areas that are having to lose their old livelihoods, to give them something else to look forward to hope for economic survival in other things. And perhaps, I don't know, you can't maybe put wind machines or something like that, windmills on mountaintops to replace coal, but yeah, that's my observations.
That's a great comment about the etymology here. Our etymologist in the room, I'm one too, but yeah, Omega, Alpha and Omega. Omega's the end. I'm not sure I want to invest in a company named Omega. Sharon.
One of the things that triggered as you were discussing some of this was the knowing what reality is, knowing what the truth is. And you know, the example you gave of, was it Susan? In the coal mine was honest. They said, this is what we want to do. We want to buy it for that. Yeah. Sometimes in situations, that honesty, that straightforwardness isn't there. There's sort of manipulation and it's hard to act on some of these virtues when you do not actually know what the real reality is, and there's duplicitous talk. There are all these screen things that are coming in different things. So I was just struck. You used the word honest and truthful at some point, and I went, bingo. There's something that's not happening. That makes it difficult to even assess the reality of situations so you can move into them.
And obviously, honesty is another virtue. That, you know, it's a sister or cousin to all these other virtues. We need to honestly assess ourselves in certain ways. We need honesty from organizations that, like the one mentioned, Omega Coal Company. And there's plenty of room for reason for suspicion, given the duplicitous, as you argue, that we have evidence of, you know, different companies that are. It's not unintended consequences. They knew exactly what was going to happen, and they just lied about what those consequences were going to be with respect to, you know, a mountain or whatever. So, all right, let me put this back on one more time. I promised to conclude with some stories of hope. So the last chapter in the book, Digging In, I call it, some examples of virtue formation. And I want to start with one right here in West Michigan. And I'm proud to say I had a very small hand in this when I was on the board of the Macintosh Greenway Partnership, merged with the Outdoor Discovery Center, but it's really been Travis Williams and others at ODC who have done a remarkable job. I'm talking about Little Hawks Preschool and Stream School. Little Hawks for preschool kids, Stream School for middle school kids, but just a brief description of what I take to be a really good example of kind of habitual disposition formation, if you want to call it that. Connecting people, land, and nature. That's the succinct motto of the Outdoor Discovery Center, Macintosh Greenway. Again, those were originally two different organizations that merged about 15 years ago. Local nonprofit in my home community of Holland in southwestern Michigan. Since its founding in 2000, the Outdoor Discovery Center is focused on nature education for people of all ages on its 155-acre site south of town. The site includes trails around lakes and marshes and forests and prairies and natural play space and catch and release fishing pond. Buildings house displays of local flora and fauna such as owls and other birds of prey, snakes, frogs. There's also a dedicated space for biology lab investigations and educational presentations. Macintosh Greenway Partnership started its own nonprofit in 1996. Its goal is to protect and connect land along the Macintosh River and its tributaries and construct a greenway path along the river. Macintosh Greenway became a part of the Outdoor Discovery Center in 2010 as part of a larger vision for creating a nature-rich community. The ODC-MG has since flourished under the excellent leadership of Executive Director Travis Williams, the steady wisdom of a talented board of directors, generous support of local donors, and enthusiastic participation of a growing number of people from the community. A sampling of recent programs includes Marvelous Mammals, Animal Crime Scene Investigation, investigating owl puke. That one got a bunch of elementary school boys, I think, were especially attracted to that one. And Wings, Talons, Ears, and Eyes, Birds of Prey. In addition to various educational programs, the ODC-MG offers conservation services such as removing Phragmites, invasive perennial grass that can take over wetlands, and raising Garlicella beetles to combat the spread of purple loosestrife, another non-native invasive species here in West Michigan. Through its Explorer network, the ODC-MG offers nature-based group trips to national and international destinations. For example, a trip through Alaska's Inside Passage from Seattle to Juneau, or a trip to Ecuador that includes visits to the Amazon rainforest, Ecuador's capital city of Quito, and the Galapagos. The ODC also has spearheaded Project Clarity, a regional effort to clean up our own local watershed. If that were not enough, the ODC-MG also runs 2 popular educational programs for children. Little Hawk's Discovery Preschool is a nature-based preschool program for 3 and 4-year-olds located on the ODC Nature Preserve. Began 8 years ago, 2013, through a partnership with local school districts and the ODC. Children spend time outdoors every day, rain, snow, or shine, learning through active play and exploration. They go on nature walks, do scientific investigations, frolic on the playgrounds, listen while outside during story time. With a staff of 14, 175 currently enrolled children, and the wait list is always off the charts. Good luck getting your preschool kid or grandkid into this program. And now enjoying use of a brand new building. It was brand new when I first wrote this. Little Hawks is flourishing, thus cultivating more interest in nature-based education. And the children and their parents are over-the-top excited about learning and going to school. I then talk about Stream School. The point is, each of these creative educational programs, in each of them, students are not only learning facts and analyzing data, they're being formed to be caretakers in their home place. Earth-keeping dispositions such as wisdom and love are being nurtured. Eco-friendly ways of seeing the natural world are being fostered. The seeds of justice and courage are being sown, and of hope. In short, ecological virtues are being cultivated in each of these local programs. All right, that's all good about a program, but what can we do? Section called Daily Life. Let me just point you to a few resources here. We're almost out of time. Some friends of mine long ago wrote this book. This is on page 139 in my book, but Lauren and Mary Ruth Wilkinson live in British Columbia on an island where they both teach at Regent College. They co-authored a book, this husband and wife duo, called Caring for Creation in Your Own Backyard. They creatively and clearly describe what caring for creation looks like in everyday life. The book is, I think, creatively organized around the 4 seasons. And they literally describe hundreds of things to do and how to do them. For example, for autumn, the suggested actions are arranged around the tripartite refrain of reduce, reuse, recycle. The winter actions are ordered by the triad of make it, fix it, share it. The spring actions fall under the triumvirate of planting, eating, protecting. And for summer, the actions are organized according to the triplet of here, there, and everywhere. Whether with respect to heating and lighting your home, using water and paper, knowing what to recycle and how to compost, sharing tools, planting trees, tending a garden, or traveling on vacation, Lauren and Mary Ruth borrow from their own lifelong experience, they're now in their 70s, to give many examples of ways to care for creation, literally, in your own backyard. Interlaced with family stories, guidelines, a bullet list, recipes, and the like, this practical guide is an easy-to-read treasure trove of virtues embodied. Leah Costamo, her husband Marcoux, and their 2 daughters live on Kingfisher Farm, just east of Vancouver, not far actually from Lauren and Mary Ruth Wilkinson. And in her book, Leah's book, Planted, subtitle, A Story of Creation Calling a Community, Leah winsomely and often humorously describes homemaking for a family in this Aurosha community in southwestern Canada. Aurosha is an organization formed about 20 years ago by a birder. It means on the rock in Portuguese. It's now an international Christian organization that focuses not just on birding, but uses birding as a way to lure people into thinking creatively about caring for creation. Yeah, founded by Peter and Miranda Harris, old friends of mine, in Portugal, where they were doing bird work years ago. Leah's reflections on earthkeeping come complete with sketches and drawings and lots of honesty about the challenges of living in community. Most of all, her musings serve as an easy-to-read practical guide to homemaking in the broad sense. I know Leah and Marcoux. I visited them, as I have Lauren and Mary Ruth Wilkinson years ago. I've seen firsthand the fruit, literal and metaphorical, of their labors, and can attest that they strive to walk their talk. And again, they, I think, embody some of the virtues I've tried to describe in this book, like simplicity and humility, patience and love, wisdom and hope. And I mentioned the Green Team here at Hope College, some local churches, Eighth Day Farm, a community-supported agriculture farm that my middle daughter, Cara, years ago was an intern at. So lots of things that we each individually can do in our homes, in our local communities. What are some things you all are doing or could do before I conclude with one last story? Yeah, Judy.
When the weather permits, I like to ride my bicycle places rather than take the car.
Indeed. You and my next-door neighbor, David Myers, who still commutes to work all through the winter on his bicycle. I've told...
Also do the Mac bus, Judy.
Yes, we do. We use the Mac bus in the wintertime. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Mac bus in the wintertime. What's the Mac bus for those who don't?
Yeah, the Mac bus is for anybody who is 65 or older in Holland, and if you live especially near the bus route, you can just hop on and tell them what your age is, show them your driver's license, perhaps if you don't look convincingly old, and you get a free ride. And all of them at the top of the hour will be at the train station, and that's where people can transfer. So you can go to a different bus. If I want to go, for example, to the library, I'll take my bus from 32nd Street to the train station, get on bus 5 at the train station, and get off at City Hall Library. And it's very convenient.
And if you watch them waiting for the bus, or if you watch them waiting for the bus or walking towards the bus, they'll often have a bag with them that they pick up trash along the way. I think you and Bill have been models to people that you don't even know are watching you.
Preach it, sister. That's what I tell students. Just pick up that piece of trash in the pine grove as you're walking. Don't worry if no one ever sees you. That's fine. Maybe someone will, though, and without you even knowing it, they'll mimic your behavior. You'll never know that, but so what? Do the right thing. Anyone else? Things that you've been doing or want to do?
I'll recommend your book.
Okay. Thank you. All right, let me conclude with one last story. We have just a few minutes left, 10 minutes or so, before we're officially done. One of my favorites. I had so much fun writing this part. It's the opening story in chapter 6, which is the chapter digging in, becoming a person of character. Future world and local leaders in training here, quote unquote. So states a well-placed sign by one of the parking areas near the prayer cabin at Fowler Camp and Retreat Center in upstate New York. Located in the Adirondacks, just south of the little hamlet of Speculator, Camp Fowler is a 285-acre summer camp and year-round retreat center located on beautiful Lake Sagandaga, which means Lake of Many Stones in the language of those native to that place. Founded in 1954 by the Reformed Church in America, a small Protestant denomination with roots that go back to 1620, this camp continues to be a vibrant place many decades later, 50 or so years later. In certain ways, Camp Fowler is similar to most Christian summer camps. There are many of the usual staples of church camp, things like morning worship before breakfast, time each day devoted to learning the stories of the Bible, chapel time at night with enthusiastic singing, much of it led by a minister who volunteers as a chaplain, different one, every week. There are regular opportunities for swimming and fishing and sailing, as well as week-long wilderness canoeing and backpacking trips to other parts of the Adirondacks. Camp Fowler's goals are shared by many other Christian camps: glorify God, to foster growth in Jesus Christ as Lord, to experience life in a Christian community, to encourage people to live as disciples of Christ. But in addition to these features common to Christian summer camps, Camp Fowler is in other ways quite distinctive. You sense things are different the moment you arrive at Camp Fowler. Whether it's the above-mentioned sign, which is in the main road, the only road into the camp, there's this sign about, future and world and local leaders in training here. Whether it's that sign or the funky bicycle that staff use to haul the latest food waste to the compost bins, not a car, not a truck, but a bicycle. Or the many log cabins that seamlessly fit their Northwood setting. You sense this camp has been carefully thought through. Your first impressions are confirmed at the first meal. The campers line up outside Fenimore Dining Hall only to have to answer crazy and often funny trivia questions to be admitted to the dining hall. You got to answer the trivia questions, which usually the staff dream up at night, and it could be anything in order to get in to get your food. The menu includes organic and vegetarian items seldom found, in my experience anyway, in typical camp fare, including in-season vegetables from the camp's own organic garden. And if you've been to the Adirondacks, you know it's really hard to grow anything on that soil. After the meal, campers learn the results of their competition to determine which cabin had the least amount of non-compostable food left over. It's called ORT, the technical term. And so we get the ORT report after every meal. Cabins then learn how much did they had the least amount of this non-compostable food left over. Also, following each meal, one of the staff leads everyone in a zany, crazy song of some sort or another. None of this is by accident. Because of its Christian identity, Camp Fowler's core values include simplicity, hospitality, and community. Simplicity names the intention to cut the clutter in our lives. Stuff, busyness, even technology, maybe especially technology, that distracts us from what is truly important. Hospitality means that anyone and everyone is welcome, regardless of those usual identity markers we have: race, class, religion, to name just a few, and those markers that often typically separate us from each other. Community indicates the commitment to live and work and play as people who acknowledge their interrelatedness and their dependence on the earth and its life-giving systems. And because of these core values, everything is suffused with the theme of caring for creation. An organic garden, composting toilets, multiple arrays of solar panels on the roofs of various buildings, a nature center, leave no trace camping on all out trips, backpacking, canoeing trips. All this is woven into this place. All this and more are indicators of how a Christian commitment to earthkeeping is woven into this place, how life at Camp Fowler is structured in such a way as to foster certain ecological virtues, like the ones we've been talking about these last 3 weeks. The main reason for this vision, the intentionality with which it has been pursued, is the camp director, one of my good friends, Kent Bushman. In the summer, Kent trains staff. He deals with emergencies. He pays the bills. He also tells bedtime stories. He's a professional storyteller, the best I've ever heard, to the many kids who flock to camp. And when he gets a chance, he joins in evening music by playing his mandolin. The rest of the year, he runs retreats, raises money, and promotes the camp among neighbors near and far. In his spare time, he cultivates an organic garden in unforgiving Adirondack soil. The work is seemingly endless. The job is never done. Kent's been at Fowler since 1986, and his imprint over these many years is considerable. Through the years, he has, with purpose and creativity, shaped the place and its practices to reflect the core values of the gospel, not least of which is a commitment to caring for the earth. But such care is always specific to a particular place. So Kent knows the history of his camp. And while he's learned much from the past, he is not slavishly bound by it. He's made some mistakes, as he himself will tell you, but he's also learned from them. He knows this particular place very, very well, the non-human as well as human inhabitants. He observes the pileated woodpeckers, the barred owls, tends the tamaracks, the golden birches, and visits folks in the local village as well as his neighbors in the cabins down the shore of the lake. This commitment to caring for the earth has informed and inspired efforts to develop a program aimed at fostering certain practices and cultivating certain virtues. For example, because of his extensive local knowledge, Ken is able to discern the possibilities of this place and is grateful for them. But he also knows when enough is enough, and thus resists the pressures to think that bigger is always better, which is very common among the camping world. Bigger is always better. Nope, it isn't. Not in this place. This camp remains relatively small and of a humane scale. Even after decades of living in this place, Ken is still awestruck by the beauty of this land, forever wild, to quote the language of the Adirondacks. Aware of both its fragility and its resilience. And he's rightly proud of the improvements over the years, largely owing to his leadership, but he's also genuinely humble about what's been achieved, aware that little could have been done by him alone. He knows the place itself is humbling. The weather, the soil, the landscape. In striving to make the camp more hospitable to others, whether from New York City or Uruguay, they have a program with a group of churches in Uruguay going back and forth each summer. Kent embodies a hunger for justice and exhibits the pursuit of love, just to list two of the virtues I've mentioned in this book. In all this, he exudes an infectious joy, such that all who come to Fowler, campers, volunteers, staff, catch the spirit of this holy place. In other words, Kent, I think, embodies many of the ecological virtues I've tried to describe in this book. Wonder and humility, self-control and wisdom, justice and love, courage and hope. 2:28. I'm 2 minutes early. Wow.
Well, we thank you.
You all, thank you.
Thank you
Thank you all for coming. And I hope you found this interesting and stimulating. And I especially hope we all exhibit the virtue of gratitude this week. So, thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, and thank you from everybody at home. I'll go ahead and close the virtual class, and we just appreciate it very much. Have a good day.